what you practice grows stronger. What you practice is when you practice imposter syndrome, you practice self-doubt, you practice self-flagellation, or even subversive being mean to yourself. That becomes a habit. And so a lot of these things that you've noticed, feeling inadequate, for example, you've been practicing that. And so you can just unpractice it. You can do it less and less. And then those habits begin to fade. And I think it's a much kinder way to look at it than like, there's something wrong with me and it's broken, I have to stop doing that, if you see what I mean. So it makes it easier because you're coming from this place of self-compassion. And when we come from this place of self-compassion, that's where we can more easily make change. And so the other thing I just want to get at is like shame, blame, and guilt, which you are all experts at. You're practicing those too. And so again, that's why that becomes your default. And so I love to think about what you practice grows not only in what you want, but practice what you don't want less. And again, it's not this cut or dry, like something's wrong with you. It makes the process just more easy and more kind. And so you don't have to fix these people-pleasing perfectionism tendencies overnight. Right? They're there and you see them. You're like, oh, I'm going to do a little less of that. I'm going to practice being a people pleaser less. And then as you hit the end of your fellowship, you're going to be much more well equipped to move forward. And so she talks a bit about self-compassion, and there are lots of different ways to approach self-compassion. And I have mentioned in several of these, I was going to call them episodes, sessions, that self-compassion releases oxytocin, which is how we can learn and grow and change. And when we're in the shame, blame, guilt side, we release norepinephrine and cortisol. She explains the science in this book. So what I advocate is if you can only read two things, read chapter 5, which is called Being Your Own Inner Ally Rather Than Your Own Enemy. And read chapter 11, which talks about the science of hand to heart and her experience with it. And I know that I've talked about hand to heart. And if you can take one thing from this, take that practice and then the noticing. But she talks about the science, which I think makes it easier to do it. For me, I'm like, oh, well, if it's going to release oxytocin, decrease cortisol, I'm like, I can do that for 5 seconds, and then what you practice grows and your body actually shifts out of sympathetic storm and more into the parasympathetic storm. And so the other thing that she has a number of quotes like in the beginning of each chapter. So also if you're like, again, because I know you're all going to skim and it's totally fine, read the quotes at the beginning of the chapters. But in chapter 5, she talks about this. The first quote is from this guy that wrote, I think it's called The 4 Habits now I can't remember what it's called, but the invitations it's like end of life. But he says, we need to see how the habit of constant self-judgment diminishes our life force, steals our inner peace, and crushes our souls. And so we are all experts at it. And so my invitation is like, can we do a little bit less of that self-criticism? Our brain tells us it's needed. And in fact, if we don't practice self-compassion, if we practice self-compassion, we're selfish, we might be complacent, we might be irresponsible, we might be judged, and it might be like a pass, or, we shouldn't be forgiving ourselves for our mistakes, etc. But I would argue that it's the opposite. And she talks about that in chapter 6, like all the roadblocks to self-compassion, which I just love. Like, we think it undermines motivation, it's selfish, it's self-indulgent. These are all the things that physicians say about it. It undermines responsibility and integrity, and it's weak. And so she gives you like all the reasons why it's not. And I know for all of you, I just want to say, if that word self-compassion feels triggering or too hard, it's just being kind to yourself. You just start there, like just to not practice habits that are harmful. So she says in chapter 5, and this is one of the things that I think really helps physicians, that self-compassion provides us the life raft that we need to navigate through tough times. By deepening self-compassion, we discover untapped reserves to strength and resilience and wisdom that help us survive the storm, and we strengthen our resources to better navigate future storms. So my thought here is, and what I really want to link this to today, is what happens when you make a mistake and or a perceived mistake. And I think that self-compassion is, we've talked about this, is the approach to that. And I think whether they're big mistakes, little mistakes, they're one of the things that trigger so many physicians, honestly, to leave medicine and to just like, they get in their way of being the best doctor, and they get in the way of their life outside of medicine. So they're very emotionally expensive. And in my experience coaching fellows, much of it is a perceived mistake, honestly, and not necessarily a mistake. But I also know from interventional cardiology that sometimes they're actually true and real mistakes. Or what I've learned about what you guys do, and I'm going to say specifically interventional cardiology, is you are acting on the edge of like what we know is possible. And so of course bad things happen, because that's how we learn. And that's how like what we do today in interventional cardiology, 5 years from now, we'll do amazing things, but we'll do amazing more things because we've practiced and had unexpected or not the expected outcome we wanted. And we learn from that. And that's, if you look back at like maybe what we could do 5 years ago, a lot of that comes from patients who died and something didn't work. And we blame ourselves and say, I shouldn't have tried that. But you can reframe it in saying that, you know, we try things, they don't always work, but we learn from them and we grow. And I would actually say that anytime a mistake happens, that's the framing, is like, well, what can I learn from this? Because when we go into shame, blame, and guilt, we just shut down and we don't learn anything. And we tend to isolate ourselves and cause ourselves harm, honestly. Does that resonate? So I like to think around this idea of shame, is that the shame around mistakes and shame around anything, and I know I've mentioned to all of you, shame is sort of my go-to. Some of yours will be guilt and some of yours will be blame. Like, what's wrong with me? It's my fault, is the blame person. And the shame person is just like the fear of embarrassment. And like, I can't even talk about it. Like, it just, for me, is like my trigger emotion. And so you know which one is yours. And for some people it's guilt. Whatever happens, you just go right to guilt. And so I think knowing which one it is, and what I would offer is that those harm us. And she talks a lot about that in chapter 5. And so when we tap into shame and being mean to ourselves, we get stuck. When we bring compassion, we're more likely to learn. And so when we bring self-criticism, we actually end up depressed. And she talks a little bit about how that happens. And so when you look at the phenomenon of physicians who are depressed and suicidal and or committing suicide, and I like to bring that up because I think it's something that we will all know someone to whom this happens, and we're a setup for it. And so knowing that, and knowing that that might be happening to your colleagues. I think I have 2 or 3 of my medical school classmates have committed suicide, for example. And many people in my institution have. And so I think to understand that it's something that is very, well, first of all, we know how, so we're more successful than other people. But also our line of work makes us more susceptible to it. And the way that we think makes us more susceptible to it. And so while it feels very negative, I offer coaching as sort of, we can begin to work on our brains early so we don't get into those cycles of self-criticism and depression and shame and blame and guilt. And so before we get into some coaching, which I want to coach on, and I'm happy to coach on this topic or anything else, about 2 years ago, when I was doing one of my early Stanford sessions, I actually surveyed a group of women physicians about mistakes that they had and the things that they wished someone had told them. And so I just want to read some of them to you, because I think I see them as kind of a life raft so that you can go back to them, and they'll be on the recording. And in fact, I think I'll pop some of them in the post-recording email, so then you can just borrow them. And I've taken out anything that identifies anybody. But I think it's really helpful to hear from your women physician colleagues what they wish they had known about mistakes and how to have them impact their career less. So this one says, I did the best I could in that moment with the knowledge and awareness I had at the time. Even if that time was an hour ago, a week ago, or a year ago, I can now choose to learn from it and apply that new knowledge to where I am now. When I remind myself that I truly am doing my best, not someone else's best, but my best, I'm open to learning more from others and from my own experience. This one says, we cannot learn without failure. Once I saw a therapist who jolted me when she said, do you think of yourself so highly that you need to be perfect, or something to that effect? I was pissed because the opposite thought usually runs through my subconscious. What if I don't know enough? What if I screw up majorly? What if I don't know what to do and this kid suffers? Realizing that we are human, deserving of grace and compassion is a good place to start and build from there. All great physicians stand on the graves of people who died because of them, sharing the stories, learning from your mistakes, and honoring the ones you lost by never repeating the same mistakes twice. Storytelling and shared experiences help, knowing that I'm not alone, that I can love myself unconditionally, and that includes times when I've shown just how human I am. I do grieve when something goes wrong in spite of knowing all of the above, and it still takes time to get over it. Honor the grief for a few days, but then I get up, wash my face, and straighten my crown. I have learned that beating myself up doesn't get me the results I thought it would. I used to believe that if I made a mistake, beating myself up would prevent another error. Now I know all it creates is more pain and no meaningful action. I call this instrumental self-compassion. I will be kind to myself because it frees up my energy to help others. Compassion is at the core of my mission and vision in all that I do. I realize that offering compassion to others without first to myself creates an unsustainable practice. Granting ease, peace, and understanding for all that I do, say, and feel allows me to extend that more fully to others, seeing and honoring common humanity and remembering that that includes me. And the best thing I did for myself is change my self-talk from doubt and negativity to confident and hopeful. Simply put, admit mistakes and learn from things you don't know. Be kind to yourself. You are with yourself lifelong. Others will come and go. So hopefully those thoughts help, and you can see that sometimes it takes people 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to bring some of those in. And so can you carry a tiny bit of that with you? And if you don't have confidence yet, I love that she put hope and confidence together. And so like, you don't have to be there yet. You're just on this journey. The other thought that I wanted to throw out about confidence is that confidence comes after the fact. So no fellow should actually be confident, okay? You go from committed to learning, to courageous in learning how to do it and showing up, to feeling capable. And then confident is the fourth part of that cascade. And so you're all you have committed to showing up, you're there, you're courageous and showing up, and you're in the procedure room doing what you're doing, and you're learning to be capable. That's where you are in fellowship. And so confidence comes later. And for many of us, it never comes, honestly. And so you might decide that you're going to be calm and grounded, or you're going to pick something else that feels different than confident, because maybe confidence is not the emotion that's most accessible to you. So I'm curious if you guys have thoughts about any of that. Did it trigger any situations, anything you need coaching about? Or is the thought of errors just too much? They're very anxiety provoking. I would say, of course, everyone who's had that, or even thinking about it or talking about it, makes us anxious, and it should. You know, we often say don't should yourself, but I would say it should make us anxious because we care. And if we weren't anxious about it and we didn't feel bad about it, we probably wouldn't care. And because you feel bad about it, it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong.